name's Helen Booth. I actually live in Carmarthenshire. We live in an old woolen mill on the outside of Llandyssil. We've lived there for 17 years. And I'd like to thank Mark and everybody involved in Tir Sir Gâr for the opportunity to speak about my work. I do get incredibly nervous, so if I get really, really fast and just throw something at me and I'll slow down, I can assure you. The first place to start probably is to give you a little bit of background about where I'm actually from. I was born in Burton-upon-Trent, which is smack bang right in the middle of the country. I just remember my whole childhood being spent outside. I used to sort of go off to the Derbyshire Dales, which is the picture in the top right, every weekend with my parents. And every summer we spent in Morfa near Porthmadog, and every Easter we spent in Snowdonia. So Wales was a very important part of my childhood, really. And obviously the landscape, you know, I think probably the time that I spent outside in the sort of open air as a child actually was very important to me deciding to become an artist. I don't think I could have actually been anything else. I was desperate to be out in the land, and it was my sort of way at that age of sort of expressing my own sort of individuality, really. Right, sorry, I will get better, I promise. Right, in when I was 17, I moved to London, and I started studying fine art at Wimbledon School of Art under Bernard Cohen and George Blacklock, who are two incredibly sort of virile, sort of abstract painters. And I was only 17, so I was completely in awe of them. I was just, you know, taken completely aback about the whole new language. And I stayed in London for 12 years. I had to work a lot in London. It was incredibly expensive at that time to stay in London, so I didn't actually get much chance to do much of my own work. We moved all over. We lived from sort of West London, East London, North, South. And 3 years before we actually left Wales, we lived in Peckham, which is Peckham High Street here. And I loved it. I did love Peckham. It was this amazing multicultural melting pot of people. But it had this sort of quite nasty underbelly, and to be honest, if I'm truthful, I did get quite scared about living in London, and sort of we made a conscious decision to leave London at that time. And also London in the sort of 80s and 90s had changed so much with Thatcher, and I know it's sort of very topical, but you know, I was there at the poll tax riots. I sort of locked myself into the National Gallery to protest about student loans. And I just got to a point where I was desperate to be back out in the landscape. So we had friends in Llangrannog who had a lovely house overlooking Loch Tyn, and I remember taking off on a Friday night, and we bought Artist Newsletter on the way, and there was a little advert in the back, and it said, large woolen mill for sale in South West Wales, change your life. And we did. We bought the mill and we moved to Wales, which is where I've lived ever since. This painting was taken within 3 or 4 months of actually moving to Wales, and I love it. I absolutely love the light, and it's quite an important picture that I took. And it's probably where my love of the landscape started again, having been in the city for so long. And sorry. I fell in love with the light, basically. And when I actually say this to people, they can't actually believe me when I say that I love Welsh light, because most people love the sort of Mediterranean, hot, vibrant light. I don't. I love the sort of November, December, January, February light. I like the light that comes in the dusk and at dawn, and I find that sort of, it's quite sinister, sort of secretive light that I really, really like. And I think Welsh light tends to flatten things at that time of the year, which I also find incredibly inspiring. I think it's probably because I am a painter. It tends to sort of flatten things for me, and then I can sort of make more sense of them that way. And what I also loved about moving out of London was the fact that we got to see dark, and you don't see dark in the city. You know, you get to see the stars, you get to see true black, which you don't see obviously because of the street lights and everything like that. So it was very, very important and right for me to move back to Wales. I could say back to Wales because I do feel that, you know, Wales was such an important part, and I didn't like living in the towns and the cities where I grew up. Wales was where I feel I grew up. It's not just the landscape as well that fascinates me. It's the periodic table as well that I find incredibly inspiring, because when I actually look at the landscape, I don't just see a tree. I see what it could possibly be made from. You know, carbon molecules. I love the H2O. I like that whole the way that the landscape is made of these sort of fundamental 103 elements, and I find that quite scary really as well as inspiring. And I like the way that the fundamental rigid structure and this sort of geometry fits everything together, and it's basic pure substance, which you don't see in the city either. You're sort of frenetically sort of running around trying to make headway and make your money and stay alive there. You don't appreciate nature for what it is, which I think you get out in Wales. In 2006, I received an Arts Council grant to take my work out of the studio and into the landscape, and I think the grant came at an absolutely perfect time for me. I spent 12 months driving around the whole countryside doing very quick, very fast drawings with charcoal, oil, plastic sheet, anything that I can grab, sort of put my hands on really. And when I look back at these drawings, I see that there's a sort of recurrent loopy mark, and I call it my memory mark, really, because it tends to be in everything that I do. There's always this sort of energy or this sort of fluidity that runs within my work, and I think it probably comes from looking at branches and undergrowth, and as well as sort of thinking about the sort of eternal structure of things at the same time. Sorry. Right. As well as doing quite a lot of drawings, I did about 1,000, 2,000 drawings at that time. I also undertook some very large pieces. You can't actually appreciate the scale of it at the moment in here, but it was actually 3 metres by 2 metres. It was a very big painting, and the light in the painting here is sort of squashed a little bit. But when you're actually standing in front of something that's quite big, you sort of become encased within the work. And the actual light within this work, it's quite light on sort of image here, is the most important piece. Light is incredibly important to what I try to achieve within my paintings. The natural dip of light collecting on the sort of headland here is what's fundamental to the piece. This is actually based on Innisloch, which is where we used to come before we moved to Wales. Most of the work that I painted in 2006 and 2008 was landscape based in a very traditional sense. It was painted in oils. It was on canvas. It had the sort of the horizon line. It was very concerned with skies and sort of space that I could create. It was a very emotional response to what I'd seen as a painter, into the landscape. And the way that I work sort of mirrored the way that the farmers were working, really, in one sense, through the windows of my studio. I would sort of build up, huge great canvases in the same way that a farmer would have a field, and I would build up layers of oil and then drag them back off again and put some more stuff on and drag them back off again, the same way that a farmer would sort of look after his own land. So there was a strange sort of symbiosis there, really. And, I would be out in my studio at very early in the morning, and the farmer would be out in his, in his fields at the same sort of time. Black. People say I have a very unhealthy obsession with black, but I can't not use black. I love the fact that it adds structure to my work. I use it very intuitively, and every single painting or every single drawing that I do always has black in there. I can't not work without it. To me, it's the colour that completely absorbs light, and by absorbing this sort of light, it sort of hides things and sort of, leaves you sort of thinking about what has been taken away or what has been hidden. There's an obvious eeriness there, but also it's the promise. At night time the light, it sort of fades and it disappears, but the following morning when the light hits it again, it's going to be there. And I see sort of the end of a day as a daily death, really, like the light is taken away, but we know it's going to be coming back. Whether we're there or not is another matter, but it's that whole sort of cyclical nature of black that I'm really passionate about. And also, when you're driving along the M4, I don't know whether you've ever noticed it, I'm so nervous. On the M4, when you drive along by Port Talbot, there's 5 very huge, thick stripes of Forestry Commission land, and they've been there for 17 years. They've probably been there for 170 years, for all I know, but they're this incredible hieroglyphic scarring on the hillside that I really find inspiring. And I know that it could be there for another 100 years, but I also know that it's not going to be there forever, and I see black as a way of the human controlling the land. Thank you. My daughter said to me, whatever you do, Mum, don't fiddle with your hair. Now, I've not got to fiddle with my hair, and I've not got to fiddle with this as well, so sorry, I shall stuff them in my pockets. Yeah.
Fiddle as you wish.
So, basically, and when you actually look at a huge landscape and you see the fields that have been sort of put in by the farmers and the trees and the sort of copses and everything, to me they are black. They don't reflect the light. They sort of swallow and absorb the light. And that's a fascination of mine, because it's that, it's that whole element of control and that whole element of memory that I see as black, if that makes sense. It's very difficult being I'm a painter. I don't, I try to sort of get my ideas across with paint and not with words, which I'm sure you can appreciate is a good idea. This is one of my favourite paintings. It's really black, sticky, syrupy, with this sort of grey, sort of bone-like colour, and this also goes back to the sort of carbon black and the calcium grey colour of the elements. And it has obvious landscape connotations. It has this sort of horizon line. It could be the sea. It could be all manner of things. But it's also, I personally would like it to be seen as sort of the human sort of interaction with the landscape. The bone is there, and the dark is there, and the bone for all of us one day won't be there, but the memory of us will still be there. Right, this painting, Moonlight, is primarily a black painting, and it was more you can't actually see a lot of it here, but it was primarily concerned with having the smallest amount of light illuminating quite a large scene, and the light sort of hinting that there was something beneath, but we weren't able to see what was beneath. And it's the way that the landscape in the winter, for example, hides all of that wonderful sort of fecundity underneath the ground, and we know it's there, and we're expecting to see it again in the springtime, but we haven't been privy to it yet. And that's the sort of landscape that I like. That's sort of the promise that things from this sort of black, tar, syrupy, oily mess is going to sort of burst forth and sort of offer different kinds of treats. Like all of us here, I'm probably drawn to the sort of how and why questions, and I have this, as well as having this sort of passion for sort of elemental sort of elements and particles and things. I've also got quite a keen interest in something called superstring theory. I'm not quite sure if if you know anything about that, but basically this painting is about sort of having an energy. Actually, if I show you the next slide, a couple of slides down. Actually, no, I'll come back to that. I'll start again. This was actually a painting that was painted and selected to be shown in the Threadneedle exhibition last year in London. And I feel that it's probably one of my most successful pieces, because it has the sort of obvious landscape, but it also has the sort of scratchy, loopy marks that I have to create this energy or balance within the work. But I'll come back to that later. I do a hell of a lot of collage as well. If I get stuck in my studio and I'm not quite sure what to do, I literally just grab in my drawers and pull out lots of paper and things, and try to construct quite quick images, always quite architectural, always sort of very strongly landscape based, and I just have some fun with it, really. I have no respect at all for paper, which is a bad thing, but I do sometimes quite like the results. But the successful ones then go on to help me paint some of my larger pieces. This is superstring theory. Superstring theory is basically the idea that we're all made up of tiny vibrating strings that sort of float through things. I'm not a physicist at all. I don't quite understand it, but on a visual level, I absolutely love the idea that we're all connected in some way, that that the carbon atom that I was talking about before has these sort of little floaty strings buzzing around the same way that a calcium would, and out of all of those 103 elements, everything that we've ever seen or part of is created. And I get the sense of this energy more so in the landscape, because we are sort of more at one with what we are there. I think I'm trying to make sense of it. The only thing that I don't really get is the fact that there are 11 dimensions, and I struggle with 3. Right. Last year I won the Pollock Krasner Award for work on paper, and this sort of gave me a small amount of money which I had to spend on paper, which was great. And I spent probably about 18 months really working hard on my etching press. And what I like about the fact that I can work on my press is just the slight sort of changes in tension that you can create very different light and sort of feelings within the work. This is actually created on big pieces of plastic that I, hammer the hell out of and sort of scratch into, and then I sort of build up lots of different layers, and hopefully they'll be off to New York soon, which is quite exciting. But if I do, it's like with my collage, if I do get stuck in my studio and I'm not quite sure what to do, then it's usually the paper that sort of has to sort of work through it with me. I've got this quite strange relationship with canvas. I never used to work on canvas. I used to work a lot on wood, and the larger pieces, the bigger the pieces got, the more heavy they got, and I had to change the way that I worked. And I've got this sort of almost reverential sort of respect for canvas. I'm always a bit sort of nervous to do things with it, which is why I just abuse my paper, because I can just get all of my tension and things out of that. Last year, I was commissioned to do a piece of work for Blink, and I got to a point in my work where I felt that it had to sort of come away from the two dimensions and it had to be pulled out into 3D. And I created this installation which was 5 metres by 5 metres by 5 metres high, and it sat inside a castle tower. It's probably about the size of this actually, and sort of high up. And I created 9 metal grids, and from those 9 metal grids I sort of hung 13,000 metres of butcher string. And then from the sort of hanging butcher string, I then sort of intercepted it all with quite large geometric shapes. And then these were then highlighted or sort of filmed with a projector, a tiny little white bar of light sort of passed across the top of it. I've actually got I'll give you an idea of what it looks like, which is, hopefully, no, oh sorry, there was a problem with this earlier. No. Oh, you can see it. I can't see it. So basically the light would start at the top of the sort of 5 metres high and then scan over the surface of the strings and sort of create this sort of quite mesmerising effect. But what I loved about it was the same as with the light in the moonlight paintings or the light in the collage, the fact that you couldn't see this, when it sort of floats over, you can only see a tiny amount of the strings and the rest was black, and I quite liked that. I sort of saw that as sort of the length of a human life really on the scale of things, and how we're all sort of like, and it's gone, we've gone, we don't have very much time here, and this whole idea of ownership and sort of being part of the landscape, it's sort of, to me I think it's a bit more sort of meditative or more sort of spiritual than that, but not in a religious sort of spiritual sense, because I'm not at all religious. So and if anybody would like to see that in the flesh, it's actually in Cardiff next month as part of the Matalumina show in the Miltwood Gallery, so pop down and have a look. And this piece is my most recent piece of work. It's called, there we go, without water, Nemesine, which is the Greek goddess of memory. And it was primarily about the fact, well, it's obvious landscape connotations there with sort of a wooden panel and the gesso. And I was bringing the geometry back in. But what I was also trying to sort of create here was the fact that underneath the geometry, I sort of stabbed tiny little holes as if a sort of running stitch had been pulled through and then pulled out, and it was almost like a geometry shape had been there before, and there was a memory of that before, which also sort of harks back to the sort of cyclical nature of the sort of landscape, and also the cyclical nature of us as human beings, how we're not here that long, how the landscape changes quickly. And that's it really, really. Thank you, Mark.